Hi, I'm Jolynn from Wild Pony Eventing, and we're here again with Carrie and Lee, and a new friend, Christi Chapman.
Hi.
Christi, can you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little bit about your horse background.
Okay. So I was raised on a ranch in Wyoming. We sold the ranch when I was in my early years, 7 years old. So didn't have a whole lot to do with ranching after that. But I loved horses and I had horses and I rode horses all the way up. I mean, I still do. And uh we the ranch that I grew up on, we had wild horses on the ranch. It was sold in the mid 70s, so after the Wild Horse and Burro Act came through. We also had a lot of experiences with wild horses, personal experiences. As a young child I did. And in my early 40s, I'd say, I took a huge interest in what was happening on the range, because this is an area that I had grown up in. I spent a lot of time out there. I worked in the oil field, so I spent a lot of time out there because of the oil field too. And I really enjoyed seeing the horses. I loved seeing the herds and watching the different families. My family did a lot of adventuring, so we went out to the country all the time, and we would look for artifacts. We would, study the animals. Conservation. I was raised in a very conservation minded family. And so my 4-H group in high school was wildlife and natural sciences. And so I spent quite a bit of time out on the desert doing those things and hunting. And the horses were always part of the landscape. And so in my early 40s, I saw a newspaper article about PZP, or birth control for
Mhm.
wild horses. And I had seen, I had experienced wild horses dying because of starvation and because of drought and things like
Yeah.
that. Personally, I had seen those things. And I had witnessed people shooting the horses because they didn't want to watch them suffer. And this was, before and after the act. And the people I was with would report to the BLM that they had maybe put a horse down because of an injury, or because it was stuck in a water hole and very emaciated, and there was really no water for it to drink. It was just the mud and it couldn't get out. And
Yeah.
um, it was tough. It's a tough life out there.
Yeah.
So I started Wyoming Wild Horse Improvement Partnership. The partner that I have in this is Mary Santagata. She lives in Connecticut. She flies out here. We are both certified to dart. We are working with the Rollins field office in here in Wyoming and Stewart Creek herd management area. But I've also traveled the United States as I hauled livestock professionally for a long time. And so it often landed me in Oregon or Nevada, particularly Oregon and Nevada and Idaho, right within an HMA. And so I got to see a lot of those areas too. And Nevada scared me. I watched Nevada go downhill really, really fast, and seeing all of that, I did not want to see that happen in Wyoming. So that sort of really pushed my interest. And that was even in the last 5 years. Um, so uh so yeah, I'm hook, line, and sinker involved in this, and we
Okay.
are darting in Stewart Creek.
Okay. So I ask everybody who comes on, personal Mustangs.
I have two. I adopted a Stewart Creek mare. I had known her from birth on the range.
Oh.
I was there the day she was gathered, and I lost it. I watched her go into the trap, and I just broke down sobbing, and Mary was sitting next to me, and she was like, "Oh my gosh." And then when I saw her in the crowds, I started sobbing again. And the BLM said, "Oh, that's the horse you want then, right?" And I said, "Well, I'm not ready for a horse, but I will give them credit. They really pushed me and helped me and they connected me with a lot of people that could help me. And so now I own her, and she had a filly the first day she was with me. So
Wow.
they knew she was getting close. They said, we want you to have this baby too. And so they made sure she got to me before she foaled. And so she was technically born with me, but she was conceived in
Mhm.
the wild. So
Cool.
I have two right now.
All right. So tonight we're going to talk about real life of the horses on the range. And we're going to specifically talk about the BLM herd management areas. And I just want to put that out there because there are other wild horses that are non-BLM wild horses. So if listeners are interested in that, let us know. But tonight we're going to talk about the BLM herds. Can you all talk a little bit about just day to day? What's the social structure of wild horses out on the range? Just going to throw that out to whoever wants to talk about it.
Ooh, that's one of my favorite subjects, so I'll go first.
Okay.
The social structure on the range, people should understand that a lot of it is the mares are basically a commodity out there, and it's they have a structure that has a leader and then subordinates, but that literally will go across quite a large span in the HMA. You could have a whole bunch of bands together. Everybody still knows their place. Everybody has a slot that they fit into, and everybody knows where they fit in that slot.
Okay. Well, you mentioned bands. Lee, you mentioned bands. So wild horses don't live together in hundreds in one big herd.
No, they'll various size bands. They could be as small as 3 or 4. They could be as large as 20, 25.
Okay.
And then they'll still hang around in groups. Other bands will stay next to some other bands for protection, usually in the springtime during foaling and stuff like that. And then they'll kind of spread out a little bit more after foaling's over. But even between two bands, the structure, it's all defined, it's all set out. And it's not just there's nobody's an equal, I guess it'd be the way to put it. Everybody knows there's somebody ahead of them
who's in charge
and who's behind them. Very few of them look at equals, and that structure is what keeps things going, and it gets intertwined into a lot of the things they do after that. And you keep seeing it pop up, and oh, that wouldn't work unless they had that structure it locked into their brain. And so that's kind of the interesting thing about the herd dynamics.
Okay. So who's in charge of a band?
The stud will always be in charge. There will always be a primary stud. If he's just got a few mares, he'll be by himself. As soon as he gets a few more mares, he'll take on a lieutenant stud. They'll help out with the duties. The lieutenant studs generally will pick up the daughters of the lead stud. And I noticed this, first of all, after when a band would take off and they would group up into their smaller bands, you could see the lieutenant would have all the younger fillies with him, and the prime stud would have all the older mares with him, and they would separate in danger circumstances. So you could really see how it was structured. When the band gets very large, they'll even take on a second lieutenant, and he's the guy that has to sit at the back and do all the fighting with all the bachelor studs that are trying to get at mares and stuff like that. And you might find other studs mixed into it. Like I said, it's very dynamic depending on the size of the herd, but there'll always be one stud who's in charge, and everybody respects him. And then even between other bands, they'll have one band that'll have one stud that just everybody kind of respects. And then the young bachelors, they get kicked out at about a year or so of age, and they're off on their own with their buddies for a couple years usually. And then about age 4 or 5, they start working their way back towards try to get some mares, either a lieutenant position or steel mares. And then that cycle just continues on. And the mares, you'll hear a lot about lead mares and bands make all the decisions. Well, if they're just wandering around, the lead mare absolutely will lead off in a direction everybody follows. But it's kind of interesting, and the studs will let them make decisions, but more often than not, you'll see a stud go up and chase the mare back to the other direction because he didn't authorize going that direction, and then he'll just turn and make her go that direction afterwards because he decided it's a good idea, but it's his idea, not her idea. But
Right.
the senior mares do have a fair bit of stature in a band, but they're basically a commodity out in the wild is probably the best accurate way to look at it.
Okay. Anybody else have comments about social structure out in the wild?
Yeah, so one of the things I've observed, and Lee, I'd kind of like to see if you've also observed this, is I've seen that mares who belong to a particular stallion will often sort of stay together with their sisters or their daughters, even if their daughters or their sisters might be off to a different stallion. And those stallions, I'm going to agree with you on the fact that the stallion is basically the one in charge. They might allow those mares to stay kind of close together and graze together and intermingle and even do mutual grooming and things like that. But when it comes down to moving, or if there's another stallion in there or they feel threatened in any way, shape, or form, they will push those mares apart. You got to go to your particular stallion, and they do stay together. Now, in Stewart Creek, I am going to say that there is a herd of about 100. But it's
Wow.
like Lee said, it's made up of family bands, these small family units that are anywhere from 3 to, I've seen up to 15 horses in a family unit like this. But they might branch off into two smaller groups, and they might have up to 3 or 4 stallions. And but they will stay really close together, and they group together at least 3 seasons of the year. They'll stay together. They all come together for winter for sure. They're there together in the fall, and they're there together in the spring. In the summertime, I do see them push apart a little bit more. But otherwise, yeah, I'm going to agree with Lee on everything that he said.
Okay. Carrie, you have anything to add?
I just, yeah, I think from what I've seen is that there's a lot of variation. So I agree with both these guys. You know, I just want to say, you know, the concept of the families is, you know, it's not a nuclear family. And I've also seen like the sister mare thing in the daytime. What, you know, horses sleep more in the daytime than at night. At night, they're more, you know, on the lookout for predators or whatever. So frequently they take turns, the mares take turns napping in the foals, and then one of the aunties will be the lookout. And I see that even with my little herd here, but I've also seen it on White Mountain, on Salt Wells, and Spring Creek Basin. You know, it's like, okay, you guys nap, but they always leave a mare as the guardian and lookout because the stallion is too busy, you know, protecting his stuff. So I've also often seen, you know, it's very fluid. I guess what I want to make the point out, this whole band thing is very fluid. And I've frequently seen, say, 2 bands of 10 with 2 band, you know, lead stallions, but several stallions within each band, and even satellite stallions that are, in this particular case, it didn't seem like he was trying to steal mares. He was trying to associate himself with the band rather than being alone. And then conversely, a lot of times you see 2 older geldings just by themselves. They have each other for company. I'm saying geldings, 2 stallions. These are on HMAs. And they just don't want to deal with the conflict. They're kind of like, yeah, it's me and my bro. I eat, he looks around, and they just, you know, have formed a, you know, mutually beneficial partnership, and they don't want to go fight over mares and stuff like that. So, you know, what I've seen is very fluid. Now in Mesa Verde, the main band that we just gathered, that stallion had a band of 17 And man, when he said jump, those mares said how high, and he could move just with a look.
Wow.
It was pretty, you know, he was like a benevolent dictator, sometimes not so benevolent. But at the same time, there was another smaller band. And once we gathered that other stallion, man, he is just such a smart, chill dude. So what I've seen is some stallions with bands who they've learned to conserve their resources.
Yeah.
And operate and not fight. Now, have I seen them in, you know, March or April? No, I have not. So that may be a different situation. But I have seen these cooperative units, which really flew in the face of what I had been led to believe before I went out and saw things by myself.
Okay.
So I would say the fluidity, cooperation, and, you know, our whole human idea of, you know, an absolute dominance model is, and the science is starting to prove that's not really applicable. It's more of a cooperative structure.
Okay.
You know, maybe leaders, there may be mutinies, but cooperation gets them further than conflict.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very true too about that. There's general rules and then there's the exceptions to the rules.
Yeah.
And like Kerry was saying, I've seen some couple older boys that just stay together. They realize, hey, we're done with this whole mare thing, and they're just the happiest, fattest boys out there, and they stay away from everybody, and they're perfectly happy.
Yeah.
And I've seen monogamous horses in the wild too, where it's just one mare and one stud, and that's as big as that group ever. They'll always be attached onto another band, but you know, so it's I think it's because every time I try to set guidelines or try to understand what's going on in the HMA, when you see stuff, you have to also throw in, okay, how does complex thought work into this? Because you know, they're capable of complex thought. We all know that have had horses. You know, it's you know, and so it changes things in the wild. Nothing's forever out there in that respect.
So how does it get determined who's breeding the mares?
Whoever can get in there.
So it's not just the main stud. That's where we're getting our diversity from, that multiple studs are breeding with the mares.
There's opportunistic breeding too.
Ah, okay.
You know,
and that can go across bands.
I definitely witnessed an event that I had never seen before regarding that. In the summer, once all the breeding was all done and the foals were all born and everything, I noticed that some of the bachelor studs, some of the younger studs that were about 2 years of age, were breeding specific mares while the lead stud just kind of stood by and did nothing. And they were causing quite a ruckus around the morning nap time when everybody's just hanging around the shade of a tree. And I saw about 3 bachelor studs or younger studs breed one mare right in front of the main stud of that band. So, you know, I try to figure out what's going on there. You know, he's letting them breed that mare, specifically letting them breed that mare. But I guess he figures that it's you know, you'd have to try to figure out how or why. It seems like an exception to the rule, but boy, it does happen, you know. And the other thing too about who breeds who, I definitely have noticed that the lieutenant studs do get some of the younger fillies because they stay in the band regardless. You know, unless they're stolen, they're not kicked out like the boys are. So the best chance for genetic diversity is to allow other studs in, which they naturally do as part of their process, having a lieutenant stud. And so that definitely affects the breeding aspects too.
Okay. So
you know what?
Jen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Just as a thought, you know, we always in our culture look at this as, you know, kind of through the eyes of patriarchy. If you've ever had a female animal in heat, they're making it very clear what they want to happen and who they want it to happen with. So I'm just going to throw that out there and challenge some of our assumption about who's choosing who. And we've all heard anecdotal stories about a mare that, you know, gets captured by a new stallion and goes through hell and high water to get back to her boy. So, you know, there's that.
And I'd like to throw something out there too. I think that what we are doing on the ranges with PZP and Gonacon and fertility control definitely has a role to play in all of this. And I think that when the mares are receiving PZP and so they're not being settled, they can continue to cycle. So they're continuing to cycle, and their stallion might, in the case of what Lee experienced, their stallion might be like, dude, I'm not getting it done. I don't know
Yeah.
why it's not happening.
Tired.
See if one of you guys can make it happen, because it's all survival driven. This is all survival driven. Horse behavior in general is driven by their desire to survive and pass on. So, those things are going to have an effect. And it was explained to me, and because I've not been able to observe it, I don't know exactly how I feel about this. It makes sense to me. But there are some people who disagree with me that have a lot of experience in this too. And they're people with a lot of wisdom. So I sort of respect their opinion, and I definitely want to see this maybe moving forward as we do some management on the herd on different HMAs. For somebody to I love the way Kerry put it. Let's start challenging some of these thinking processes. And this is an area where I think that we should challenge too. And that is that, as much as I love PZP and the fact that it can help us with population control, should we look at the ways that it's potentially disrupting a family structure? And there are some other fertility control methods that are available. Gonacon is one, but permanent sterilization is another. And how would those affect herd structure? If you had a mare and a stallion who, as Lee had mentioned, are very bonded, what would be the harm in permanently sterilizing them if they've had several offspring and allowing them to stay on the range? Where would there be harm in that? As long as they were able to get back together and be together as a bonded pair. What would be the harm in, and maybe using Gonacon in older mares? Lee and I have had that conversation, and I really appreciate his opinion on that, because I feel that way. I feel like it should be used in older, or it should be a tool that we go to in older horses, because I feel like the way it works, the mare is not going to cycle anymore, so she's not going to continue to be bred. So those are some things too. I do wonder. It was brought to my attention by somebody who has the experience in the fertility control, that he felt like PZP was kind of encouraging some infidelity, because the stallion could not get the breeding done. So he felt like it was encouraging some of that infidelity within the herd. And so Gonacon, in his mind, was going to create more herd fidelity, and that's going to create band stability. So, I feel like we don't necessarily have all the answers yet.
Yeah.
And we're playing God, and we really need to be aware of all of the factors that are involved.
Okay. A few more things about horse behavior. So horses are on the move most of the time, and how does being in an HMA and being fenced, does that impact that behavior? Do we know that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I think it can. I think that from my observations, as a child, before the act and after the act, and talking to people who had witnessed that, I think that, I can't really say now, but I think that there's like a nucleus. and the HMAs are where the resources are.
Yeah.
And as the herd population increases, that nucleus starts spreading out further and further and further. And so I know that they have fenced some of the HMAs, that there are some cross fences across some of the HMAs, and those can impact a lot. They
Mhm.
can really be detrimental.
Okay.
Yeah, in the Kiger HMA, it's 35,000 acres, but it's fenced off into about 7 individual pastures.
Ah,
And so as what you were saying, that impacts the actual total area. It's kind of a balance. The pastures gates are opened and closed throughout the spring, summer, and into the fall for cattle movement, to have a holistic grazing pattern. They'll move the cattle into one pasture, and then move them into another one and shut the gates behind. And it, generally speaking, the rancher is managing the horses at the same time, and the rancher has to make sure that if they're closing off gates, that area the horses are locked into in that particular area have water and stuff like that. And luckily in the Kiger HMA, the rancher that grazes in there is usually on top of all that. It also presented a benefit this last year. We had basically 3 groups of 80 horses, and 2 of the groups were together in the early spring, and the cattle were using pastures that none of the horses were going to use. And so at one time when there was 80 horses in one pasture and 80 in another, they split up. That gate was left open for cattle, but I talked to the rancher and said, why don't we just close it for the summer? And then at least the water resources are evenly spread. The food is evenly spread between the 2 groups of 80, and the other group of 80 was in a whole different pasture. And so he said, yeah, sure, go ahead, let's close it for the summer. So we kind of made the pastures work in our benefit there. But that was only because of the drought situation, low water situation, and lower feed situation, that, that fence actually became a management tool for a change instead of something that normally would be a nuisance to the horses. Now the
Right.
horses, those gates are all open now, and they'll be all open right through till March. So the horses have, in the wintertime when food resources are less, they have the whole HMA that they can go for food kind of thing. And so, but yeah, it's just some of them, the fences are fences, and I have the Riddle HMA has no fences inside. It's all one big open area, and the horses there do have a migration. They will, in the winter and spring, stay in one area that the water holes dry up early in the spring there, and then they move up into the higher areas and kind of follow the snow as it melts, and then the snows drive them back in the fall. And without the fences, it would be a different story in Riddle if they had fences separating them all up. But there they do have a natural migration. And the Kigers in the Kiger HMA basically don't have that. There's one group that stays in the higher area, one group stays in the lower area, and another group kind of wanders around between.
okay. What happens when a wild horse gets hurt or sick out on the range?
The BLM at times, if I've noticed that the Kiger HMA and at other HMAs in Oregon, the BLM Oregon will, if you see a horse with a broken leg, they will have an employee that's going out there, dispatch the horse, or they will make a specific trip to do it, especially in some of the areas where a lot of the general public, might be around and stuff. It just, but it's a very specific injury. It has to be clearly a broken leg
Yes.
or a horrible injury before they're going to put a horse down. But they will come out and put them down, at least if they have time and everything. I don't know how much they would do it nowadays.
Okay.
And I've experienced that too. And I hope you share some of the photos that I sent of the big knee and
Yeah.
injuries we've seen. I mean, I report every time I'm out in Stewart Creek, but also any of the other Red Desert Complex areas. And I've been in Rock Springs too, and I've reported to the herd management specialist when I see an injury, and he will, or she, in a couple of cases, will go out and observe that horse. And they do encourage the public to call. So, I'd like to put that out there, that if you're ever out in an HMA and you see a horse that, you know, you feel that like it needs to be looked at, they'll go out, they will look at it and determine whether or not it needs to be put down. I've come across some foals that have been pretty severely injured. And a few of them have been given a pass, and a few of them they've euthanized. We came across we've come across several that have had some pretty horrific injuries that the BLM has euthanized those horses.
What's happening to them?
You know, they lose a lot of weight. They can't move very quickly. So they are vulnerable to predators, but they're clearly in a lot of pain. And it's interesting to me, I've gone out a lot of times afterwards and watched the carcass because they leave them there. And there are quite a few times when those horses are not disturbed by scavengers or predators or anything else until the bugs come along. And it's usually
Oh,
the
wow.
bugs that help decompose the body, and then maybe some of the bones might get scattered after that's done. But that usually tells me that it's that the horses incurred an infection as a result of
Yeah.
the injury. The one that really comes to mind was a young stallion that, I mean, his hock was completely shattered. And I mean, you could see the bones, and how that had happened, we're not sure, but completely shattered. And he'd been that way for quite a while. And he'd also developed, when he fell after he was euthanized, you could see how his muscles had compensated for things to the point that he really had like a deformity because of all of that. What's interesting to me is, and with the foals especially, we've observed that the rest of the band members will come by, and even extended band members. So if it was, you know, just maybe a small family band, you might see some of those outside band members come by, and they'll stand guard over them for a while. You can tell who's bonded to the horses that are put down, because they'll stay there for a while, and you can tell when they're not bonded, and nobody else. I mean, they just they leave. It's like, it's almost like a relief. And there's usually, I mean, with every injured horse I've ever observed out on the range, there's always one or two that will stay with that horse. They always have a protector. And I do have a picture with you that I do hope you share. I mean, it's not the best picture at all, but it's a picture of a stallion that he's, to my knowledge, he's still out there, unless he's died because of the weather. It's very cold, and he's going to be struggling. He doesn't have the resources to go into a winter right now. But the BLM, I mean, we've had 2 different specialists from 2 different offices go out multiple times to try to find that horse. And sometimes, and they can't. I mean, we can be sitting there watching the horse, and when we leave to go meet the guy that's coming out, we go back and the horse is gone. And where they're going, if I have no idea where he's going, because we're going right back to that place, and the rest of them haven't moved on. You've got to understand that that's kind of a divine intervention.
Yeah.
So.
Can I say something, Jolynn?
Yes.
That is just again pointing out the difference in the different HMAs and terrain and population, because you know, on a smaller HMA that's more accessible, like the Kiger or Spring Creek Basin, or in a highly populated area like where Willis Lamb over near Reno, and he's called out to do, you know, get horses out of cattle guards, and they're on the road and everything. And their BLM is pretty responsive too. Then there's other areas like the middle of stinking Nevada, where, you know, one specialist is handling, I mean, at one point it was something like close to 100 HMAs, right? One horse person. And it's the ranchers there. I don't want to say like, oh, I'm all pro rancher, but the ranchers, she tells me she'll get a call. They'll call her and say, there's a horse in the cattle guard. There's a horse stuck in the water. There's a horse that's been coming around my barn. He looks really sick. And they're the ones that are BLM, and she gets out there, you know, and so again, just pointing out that there's different conditions in all these different HMAs that allow for different solutions. I have found carcasses on the HMA, and I saw one amazing video where it was from a game camera where I don't know why the horse died, but in like 2 days, the golden eagles had just picked it clean. So that's part of the natural things, right? And you know, so it just varies. And I've also seen horses on the White Mountain HMA with really bad, some kind of venereal, and apparently that's not uncommon. And that's, you know, and I was told, well, you know, report that to the office because that is a long, painful way to die. You know, if a stallion has an infected penis. So yeah, there's a lot of variability, and there's some, you know, like Christi pointed out, some really horrific injuries that just, you know, in that case, you know, having a good, strong predator population would be a blessing. But, you know, as we talked before, that's not part of most of those ecosystems, just because of the topography and whatnot of takes for a big cat or something, take something down.
Okay.
If I could add one quick story too, regarding you know, the herd structure in this subject. We came across a foal that was attacked by cougar, but still alive and with their band. And what ended up happening was the mare stayed with the foal, and the stud leader of the band stayed on top of the mound where the foal was too. But it was interesting how the rest of the band reacted. They knew the foal likely wasn't going to make it, and they stood off to the side. But they participated in a action that was rather amazing to watch. Both the mare, the mother, and the stud went down off the mound. It was a mound around a water hole, and joined the other 6 or 7 in the band. And they all ran away and left the foal lying there on top of the water hole. And they ran about 30 yards. They didn't run far, but every one of them was looking back as they ran off. And what they were actually doing was trying to stir up the flight response in the foal and to see how it would respond. And the foal barely twitched its ears. It was lying down. And it's like the whole band knew that no, that it's not going to make it. And the rest of the band stayed off to the side. Or I should say, the mare went back up by the foal. Everybody in that band went over and sniffed that foal after that, and then walked over and regrouped and waited. And then the stud went over and sniffed the foal. And at that point, we decided we were just going to leave. And less than 2 minutes later, we noticed all the horses walking across the meadow. And we went back, and the foal had finally died. And they waited till it died before they left. But just watching how they acted, how they all responded and everything was, I would have never expected that kind of complex thought once again. But it was really interesting to watch that how they tried to coax the foal up and, you know, use that flight response to see how well it was doing. And we documented it and sent pictures to the BLM. It had puncture marks from teeth marks. It had a crushed jaw is why it ended up dying. And it was born, we saw the mare the night before, so that foal was born sometime either that next morning. And it had claw marks on its neck, fresh puncture marks from the claw of the cougar. So it was a cougar, grabbed it at birth basically, and then, you know, it was sad to watch, but it was interesting to watch too.
Okay.
I'd like to add something too, Jolene, really quick.
Sure.
I've seen horses colic out there too.
Really? I was going to ask if horses in the wild colic. Okay.
Yeah, and I watched, in fact, the mare that I own right now. she colicked on the range, and we documented it. And it was interesting to me to watch her herd mates paw her, and they would, I mean, they were not nice. I mean, thunk her really hard, and she'd get up and she'd walk with them, and then she'd lay back down, and they kept her up and moving. And then it took about 2 days and she was okay again, and she was up grazing and walking with them. And I watched her pass manure several times. But I thought that was quite interesting. And I have seen
Yeah.
her do that to her foal. And she walks over, and when she's not happy with her foal laying down, she would walk over and thunk her pretty hard with a hoof. And baby'd get up and look around like, okay, what do I need to be wary of? And I've watched them do that on the range too. So yeah, interesting that Lee observed what he observed. I like
Yeah.
hearing the story.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of our volunteers,
Sorry.
Pizza Verde Band Battalion colic one day and get himself through it. I mean, it definitely happens.
Yeah.
Okay. So are the horses actually down with colic?
And
Yeah.
rolling,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
she was, mine was down and rolling too. I was afraid she wouldn't make it. And
Wow.
I went out, like I said, I spent all of a day. We went off and watched some other horses, came back to her, went off and watched some others. And then I went out early the next morning by myself and spent the whole day watching her. And then the third day she was up and eating fine. So,
That's fascinating because I've been told by people in the past that wild horses never colic.
no, stand colic, especially around here, is a problem because there is.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that brings you around to the, when you want to talk about range management,
Yeah.
some of the pictures I sent you, I mean, they've got to get down to the grit to
Right.
get what's.
Okay, so let's segue into specific HMAs. And so I would like Lee to talk about Kiger Riddle HMA because relatively that's a fairly healthy herd and HMA. And I say relatively because I think we're going to get into environmental disasters are impacting just about everything. So Lee, you want to go ahead and talk to us a little bit about how Kiger Riddle's doing?
Yeah, the Kiger and Riddle HMAs have been managed pretty regular since the 70s. A good 40 years. Of every 4 years they were gathered. They're managed as one herd. So post-gather, Kiger would have about 55 horses. Riddle would have about 45 horses. And they would always move a few back and forth every time they would do a gather. So realistically, they're managing a low AML of about 100 horses. The unique circumstances of the way the mountain causes weather patterns in the area gets them a little bit more rain than other areas in Oregon. So the range is in real good shape. The cattle grazing is well done, and the numbers have been kept down over the years. And so, it was pretty much the perfect scenario. They created a lot of hype about the horses, so they have 100% adoption rate when they do a gather. And so kind of everything that needed to be done right has been done right in the Kiger and the Riddle HMA for 40 years. They missed their 2015 or 2019 gather, and so now we're about 3 years past their normal 4-year cycle of gathering. And the first year or two after, there was a cougar issue for 1 or 2 of those years that kept the population kind of in check. We noticed it a little bit. But the population just growing like gangbusters now, and so now we're looking at is the range degraded? Well, yeah, you can see a little bit more areas that they generally use around the water holes and stuff is eaten down really good, but they haven't had to cut back on the cattle grazing, and the horses have plenty of feed still for the winter. I will suspect there will be feed issues possibly next winter if they're not gathered next year. So we'll have to wait and see. but the water issues their whole pattern has changed because of the water issues and the numbers that are there. Before they would wander around and had a routine where they'd wander around regardless of the water issues. But I notice now with the water holes drying up, they stay by that water hole, and they will really graze heavily around that water hole till it dries, then move off to the next one.
Yeah.
And then where they normally would end up later in the summer and a normal year, they're hitting that in by June now because it's a flowing water source. But so things are changing there. It's not a crisis situation now. It's certainly not an emergency gather situation yet. But I'm hoping that documenting everything that's going on there will prevent it from having to get to the emergency gather situation, which is how Oregon's been getting gather permission for a lot of their HMAs the past couple of years. But so it was managed very well, and to tell you the truth, if it wasn't managed well, things could have gone all to hell a lot sooner than 3 years past the gather. It's great for me, interesting for me to watch the numbers grow, see how the herd behaviors changed, and see how the distribution changed or stayed the same. But I don't want to see the horses. They're all fat and happy right now, but I don't want to see them going into next winter thinner and with less feed.
Right.
And because there's nobody out there watching. There's nobody really paying a lot of attention. The BLM has, like we were talking, hundreds of HMAs and very few employees. So unfortunately the ranchers get a lot of grief about grazing and stuff, but they're the eyes on the range right now, and they're the ones. I know a couple of the emergency gathers in Oregon were because of ranchers that reported, hey, there is no more water there. We've been hauling water for 2 years there. We're done. You need to come and deal with this.
Yeah.
And there is a format that everything can work, but then if you don't gather and population takes over, it's a game changer. Unregulated population growth is a game changer for how you manage what you have to worry about. Everything changes then, and if the population's kept at a decent level and the range can, then you have your buffer, and the Kiger's HMA is eating up its buffer at this particular point in time. So we'll see, in the next 2 years, it should be interesting to see how it works out.
What are the numbers right now? Do you know?
Well, we did a pretty thorough count of 238 in Kiger last year. I'm imagining with this year's full crop and everything, by next summer, I'd say it's very possible they could hit 300 just in Kiger alone.
Wow.
At least going to be 270, 280. I'm still trying to figure out. Some bands I noticed don't have really a lot of foals with them, if any at all, from this year. And other bands have a healthy full crop from this year, so it'll be interesting to see. I might never be able to figure out why that is. It could be a cougar in the one area, but both these bands are kind of in the same area. So,
right.
It's going to be interesting to see how it all pans out.
How much has fire and drought impacted the HMAs this year? Kiger and Riddle
drought,
specifically.
Yeah, drought, the water source. Riddle, you don't really notice it as much because the horses migrated because of the one area where they spend their winter and spring. There's just water holes there, no flowing water. So once they're dry, they would move to where the creeks are farther up in the highlands of the HMA. So I don't think it's affected them as much, because when they go back that other area, even the cattle aren't grazing that area because there's no water. So there's plenty of winter feed for them and stuff there. Kiger, the water resources were strained. That's the first sign, seeing how they've been strained, and that's the one to really watch out for, because I had a camera set on one water resource that literally, it was a small little stream that would flow, but in less than 24 hours, 400 yards of that, over 400 yards of that stream just dried up.
Wow.
And that was it. The horses were there trying to sip in the water, and it was gone. And then they moved on, and then they moved to a whole different area because that water had extinguished itself. Done, And another herd was using that water source farther up, so I kept a close eye on that, and also did the rancher. Because he also knew that if that water source dried up, and these are spring fed, so they can just shut off. Basically, they're filtered water that trickles out and has a reserve behind it. So once that reserve's gone, that trickle can all of a sudden just stop. And although he said he'd never seen it dry out, even he was keeping an eye out for that, because he was going to have to open some gates if that water source dried up, so that they could use another one.
Do both of those HMAs provide food all year round, or have they ever had to have supplemented with hay?
No, there's food is not an issue as of now. And it's just such a large area and so few horses, and the cattle grazing so regulated too. It's just it's really not a problem at all in that area for that. I think the cattle grazing allotment is lower than a lot of areas would be, and the horse population's been kept lower in a lot of areas, and so it's just a bountiful supply of feed. That was never really an issue. But you know, they're around the water resources. There's areas it looks like a barren wasteland. Like I've been over to South Steens HMA a few times and was shocked when I saw the ground there. And I thought, what are these horses eating here? And you know, just hang out by a water hole, and all you had to do was look 2 miles in the distance, and you'd see this string of horses coming from 2 miles away because their feed is so far away from the water sources.
Right.
And I just felt so sorry for those horses. It just, you know, and this is an area that the cattle hadn't even been grazing on for a couple years. And you know, I know the rancher there, they've been doing some shuffles adjusting for the fact that the horse population there was supposed to be, I think 250 was, you know, up to 1,1400 and had been that way for quite a few years. And so the Kiger HMA, I noticed some areas are pretty barren. The horses now are up kind of in the hills a little bit, you know, the area that, you know, a little rockier, a little rougher, but that's where the long feed is during the snow. And generally speaking, food is not an issue as of now. I think we're going to start seeing food issues maybe next year, you know, by next winter kind of thing. It'll be interesting to see.
Okay. Okay, so there are some other HMAs, Stewart Creek and the Red Desert Complex, that aren't as healthy as Kiger Riddle. Do you guys want to talk about that a bit?
Did you have anything you wanted to say, Carrie?
No, you know about that area.
Okay. So I think one of the things that really sticks out in my mind was Mary's only out here, my partner with YWIP. She's only out here twice a year, sometimes 3 or 4 times a year, but for the most part, it's twice a year. And we don't hit all of the Red Desert Complex when she comes out. I mean, we might be focused on a specific HMA. And her favorite HMA, I think, is the Lost Creek HMA, and it adjoins. It's also part under the Rollins district. And I sent you a picture of that area that shows a watering hole and a trough, and that's one of the major watering sources there. There's also a creek that runs to the other side of it, but technically that creek is off HMA. So the horses really shouldn't be able to access it, but they do. The fences are usually down. They usually end up over there, or I think they might jump cattle guards, which is one of the reasons I think we see a lot of the injuries we see, because horses are crossing cattle guards and going through fences. But Mary and I went by that a full year after her first year out here. And she said, I mean, as soon as we rounded the corner and crossed the cattle guard into the HMA, she went, "Oh my God, this looks horrible." She said, "Remember the pictures I took last year, and the grass was so tall, and it was in both times were in the fall." And she said and there was no grass. I mean, it was down to the dirt everywhere.
What part of Wyoming is this?
So this is north of Rollins, north of Wamsutter. The Lost Creek HMA is there's a dirt road that goes between the town of Wamsutter off of I-80, and then from 287 Jeffrey City, and so it's called the Wamsutter Jeffrey City Road, or Wamsutter Creeks Gap Road, and it's a pretty major dirt gravel road. And Lost Creek intersects that road, or crosses that road. And the water hole that I sent you the picture of with a lot of horses on it, that particular hole, and it is a solar well, and it has a long trough system. And I didn't even know that existed. It was a BLM specialist that took me in there. I was like, look at all these horses everywhere. And he said, this is one of the major water holes for this area. And I was just shocked. I'd never even known about it. And every time I've gone back there, there's still, that whole area has a significant number of horses that go there. The Lost Creek HMA, I think, is 60 to 80 horses. And there are always more than 100 in there, always more than 100, even after the gather. And I think they cross HMA. I think these horses are actually coming from other areas and down into that water source. But they are impacting that particular area pretty heavily because of the water, as Lee mentioned. You know, the water's there. They're going to stay where those resources are. In Stewart Creek itself, there are a lot of water sources, and they're solar wells for the most part. There are 2 really good reservoirs that are, one is a natural fed reservoir, and the other one is from a solar well. And both of those, you know, they try to turn those water sources on and off to move cattle around and to move the horses around. And so they will turn those water sources on and off to encourage them to move. And we've seen cattle and horses really impact both. The horses, because there is more than one well running at a time, I see the horses move. And they'll move in groups. And we have yet to do this. This is one of our goals, is to really break down this behavior and observe it in the area. And we need to get some game cameras. Like Lee has, I love Lee's game camera footage because it captures so much. And I really want to do the same thing in Stewart Creek. Stewart Creek is divided by a great big feature called Bull Springs Rim. And so then there's kind of the east and the west sides, and it kind of goes across and isolates the northeast corner away from the rest of the HMA. And that northeast corner, there's other water sources out there. Not many horses live out there. It's pretty brutal country for horses. It's very steep. And then there's nothing to eat, like nothing to eat. And I've sent you some of those pictures.
Yeah. And is this new, or is this always been?
It's always been like that.
Okay.
It's always been like that. It's just the natural topography. It's very, very rocky. The feed that is out there is really good feed, but there are so many rocks that it really impacts the amount of feed. And that's on that northeast side. And then there's a lot of like just wasteland, like it's clay, and the only things that grow in that whole bottom area, it's very flat. It's an ancient lake bed. So there's a lot of cactus and greasewood and just completely inedible things out there. And there's a lot of sand. But then on that other side, like I said, the south side that it sort of wraps around that rim too, that's where all those other water holes are at. And so we have seen the horses move more so than the cattle. And the horses will do this nice little circle where, we'll see the little bands move, and it's that herd of 100 horses. Stewart Creek HMA is 125 to 175 horses is the AML. And on that range right now, I'd say that we're probably at the high end, just because after the gather, there were some foals born out there. They missed a few horses, and there were a few mares that didn't take on the PZP clearly because they had foals. And so I'd say we're at the high AML right now, but you do see that movement, and they water here, they graze to this, they go up and over some places. They water at this one, then they kind of move, and they move in their little groups. And there's sort of a hierarchy in that little whole progression of things too, where one band will not come in until the next band has moved on. And you'll just sort of watch them. And the elk are in there. There's a lot of elk in there too.
Right.
Probably about 40 head of elk altogether. There might be a little less than that. But I would say close to 40 head of elk. And they make that circle as well, and lots of antelope. And the cows, like I said, they usually stay really camped out on their particular water holes. So and we've watched there's a few mineral licks they go to, and they do the water, they go to the mineral lick, then they graze down here, then they nap here, then they go to this water.
Natural mineral lick or something that's been put out?
Nope, they're natural.
Okay.
I even took one of the specialists out the other day, and we looked at it, and this was, like I said, this was there are no trees out there now. There are absolutely no trees out there, but we found a petrified log that was about 80 feet long.
Huh.
And it's mostly buried. There are tons of chunks of petrified wood out there, lots of artifacts. It used to be, I don't know the time frame, but it was all a redwood forest at one time.
Wow.
And we are sort of wondering if it's not something to do with the petrified wood that the horses are licking, but there are some big, huge boulders out there. And I've watched the horses just standing there nibbling on them and licking on them and chewing. And then there's a couple of places where the dirt is a little bit of a different color. They go over, and it can be 5-6 feet across, maybe a little more in some places. And they'll all stand and just eat that. I mean, they're nibbling the soil nonstop.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So Carrie, you had sent me.
I'd like to add one thing to that. I've noticed the Kigers and their mineral licks are used mostly just in the springtime. The mares, in the month and a half before they foal, they're digging up the ground, and they're literally eating dirt, and they're going at it. And it literally seems like the mares, and like they even tore up holes in the middle of the road last spring. But it's that same time every year, and they abandon them. I never see them touch them again after that. Now, those aren't necessarily salt licks or anything. They might have natural salt licks somewhere that they'll hit you around. But it's interesting that the mares, it's like they need that extra little boost of minerals just before they foal.
And I think it's interesting that you identified, because I didn't realize this until you said something, but yes, it is in the spring when I observe that behavior too. And they're nowhere in that area any other time of the year.
Yeah. Okay. So Carrie, you had shared a map of desertification, and because Christy brought up the environmental changes, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I would love to. And I will say that my kids found a little 6-foot wide place in my round pen that they like to lick. So there you go. And they get supplemented, right? Yeah, the climate change is clearly affecting us. And as you know, I mentioned in our previous conversation, there's been big changes in the Great Basin area where almost all the HMAs are. So it's being impacted by drought, and it's being impacted by drought, both from a lack of water standpoint, and then also the impact of animals on a landscape that's not getting enough water. So the resilience in the landscape itself is not there. And I kind of wanted to shift the conversation a little bit, like something that Lee mentioned. And I sent you a picture of the White Mountain water source for almost all those horses up there. If you understand the hydrology, and I'm no expert, but I have dug into it. A great book to read is a book by Craig Childs about this area, the Four Corners area. I'll have to get the name of it. You can put it in the reference, but it's like In Search of Water or something like that, because the water will, like a river, will surface overnight and then over the course of the day disappear.
Huh.
So when animals are drawn to a water source and there's less of it, so they're hanging out there more, and the more heavily they impact it. And I don't know about y'all, but my Mustang, like, I think, oh, are you thirsty? Do you want to drink when we're out on a long trail ride? No, she just wants to like hoover up the grass that's along. She never wants to drink. She just wants to eat that grass.
Yeah.
And that's what horses love, because it's highly nutritious. It's sweet. And I mean, other animals too. But over time, what happens, it's a little counterintuitive, but the plants, especially deep-rooted plants, hold water. So for instance, if I have a rain here, you know, it runs off the areas that aren't vegetated. And then when I go to areas where there is good turf, that soil is really, really moist. It's a big sponge, you know, because that's basically, we're talking about a big sponge here. So when horses or any other animals keep hitting that spring-fed stream, the water table drops. And that's what Lee said, you know, that 400 feet or so of that water source that just went away. Well, that sponge loses its ability to hold water. So you're seeing these spring sources that have been there for a long time just turn into seeps, and then they paw at them, which further degrades that. And there are places, and I've heard people say, well, BLM is fencing the horses off the water. And what they do is they make an exclosure around that spring, and then you'll see a pipe running from that spring to a trough, so the horses can get the water without degrading the spring. And
So is it their instinct to dig to get to water? Is that why they do it?
yeah, there was even a study with donkeys down around in Death Valley, Palm Springs area, where they were digging like 4 or 5 feet down.
Oh my goodness.
Like, oh, they're, you know, they're finding and sourcing water for the rest of wildlife. And that may be true, but then what happens long term? That water, you know, if it's overused past the point of replenishment, it's like if you have a well, I know probably a lot of your listeners have wells. If you overdraw that well, or your neighbor overdraws his well, the water table drops. And all over the country, not just in the West, right now, all over the country, people are having to dig their wells deeper, a lot deeper. So, you know, that's essentially what's happening in a lot of these areas. And, you know, Kiger, for instance, is a very small, well-managed HMA. But when you go to Nevada and Utah, you know, it's millions of square miles of something that looks nothing like the Kiger HMA.
Right. Of desert.
You know, so Spring Creek Basin here, it's just under 22, it's like 21,900 something acres, just under 22,000 acres. National Mustang Association bought the last remaining grazing lease a couple of decades ago, or maybe about a decade ago. And so there's no livestock grazing. And they actually have been able to increase, they added 3 sand wash basin mares to improve the genetic diversity, because it's being very successfully treated with PCP and has a near zero population growth. So they were able to add 3 horses, 3 mares. But there's water, you know, again, NMA has worked with them with this, putting in water catchment systems that catch condensation and then run it into a trough. There's other situations in Nevada where, like Christi said, the water source is actually off the HMA, and then it's piped with a generator, pumped 1,000 feet or so into the HMA. And then I've seen, and I think I sent you a picture of that. The Davis pipeline runs, I think, for 2 miles, and the rancher maintains that and pumps water 2 miles to get it to where it needs to be, and the horses have access to that. So if you see aerials of some of these springs that are out in the middle of nowhere, the trailing that comes in from every direction to that spring, you can see those trails carved in the desert for a couple of miles, and everything is completely desertified around that spring. So, you know, I think it's hard for people to wrap their mind around the vastness of some of these big desert HMAs, because you can't, you know, for example, Anarchy, people can fly into Salt Lake, rent a car, drive to the Pony Express stop, and there's the horses, you know, ready to be photographed. And if you take, you know, US 50, the loneliest highway across Utah and Nevada, it's a completely different experience. So, I mean, I just really encourage people to be open-minded, and if they're really adventuresome, you know, take a trip, because when I first went out there in 2014, I mean, I just looked around and said, my God, there's nothing to eat here.
Yeah.
You know, and I have some photos where even in the desert, a healthy ecosystem is gauged by the amount of litter under, for example, a sagebrush. You know, the litter packing around those desert scrub plants hold moisture.
Yeah.
You know, help hold the water table, and it's not there. Yeah. So all the things that you would look at as a plant specialist or a range specialist to evaluate a healthy desert landscape, you're not seeing that.
Yeah. How is,
you know, I'd like to add one more thing about the water resources. People have to understand that you would think that you could just create a water source, dig a well, do this, do that to help out. And, you know, a lot of areas you probably can, but it's quite a process when you want to touch anything to do with a natural water source, spring. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of environmental studies that have to be done. And then you're talking for such a small area, how much money is going to be spent to improve that water source in that area. So it's not just a matter of, hey, let's just dig a well and put a water trough here. I was looking at trying to improve some water sources at the Kiger Riddle. I thought, well, what a wonderful idea, improve that water source, and the horses will use that, you know, instead of just focusing in the one area. And I thought I'd get Fish and Wildlife on board. I thought, boy, they'll be interested in getting some more water sources out there. And they're like, no, we don't like creating water sources. We don't want to create water sources. They can create disease for the wildlife. And, you know, they had all the reasons in the world why they didn't like producing water sources, you know, and so there's that aspect of it too. You know, it's a very complicated issue, water, you know, and like Kerry was saying, in Nevada, a lot of the water sources are all privately owned compared to other states too. So, you know, water just filling up a tank isn't the way to go, necessarily the solution. I think the South Steens gather, they put up some temporary water tanks, trying to attract horses to an area, or to try to make sure that they had some water in the weeks before they could do the gather. And then when they didn't fill them afterwards, it was a internet sensation of how they're not filling the water troughs. They're not filling the water troughs. Well, the BLM was wanting the remaining horses to encourage them to go to the other water source that actually existed and not be dependent on that area. And that's why they hadn't filled them. And then they went out and filled them just to shut everybody up, because they got tired of, you know, everybody complaining about it. So water resources, it's all across the board, what you can do with them, what you can't do with them. And, you know, I had one spring that the horses were getting stuck in the mud and breaking legs. And it was an 1.5 acre, 2 acre area that was all fenced off. It had a beautiful fence done up, but it had fallen down over the years. And the BLM trying to get permission to rebuild it was like pulling hair. You're like, oh, we got to do a NEPA, we got to do this, got to do that. And I said, well, it's already there. You know, so I got permission to use some of the remnants and protect the spring. and it worked. You know, that the spring area is well protected and it's got grass growing and everything, and then everything on the other side of the fence is absolutely destroyed. You know, so next year we'll look at expanding that, you know, but
Yeah.
trying to, I had the idea of putting a solar trough there so it could be used more, you know, more other than when it just dries out. And they're like, nope, can't do that. That's the whole different report, whole different permit, and likely wouldn't be approved because it's a natural spring. So, you know, water is a big issue, and water is a very complicated issue.
So
Good
the drought is impacting water and food resources, and where the HMAs are degrading. How is that impacting horse health and the social structure of the herds?
Ooh, can I answer?
Yeah.
I'd love to. So first I want to say something. I know that Carrie's got a photo that she sent to you. And it shows and she was talking about desertification, and it shows the sagebrush and the grass poking up through the sagebrush.
Yeah.
That is an excellent photo of, and then I sent you one too of an exclusion that was done, and you can see the difference of the grass inside and outside of that exclusion for grazing. But it's an excellent photo about how reliant the grass itself is upon the sagebrush for survival, because that
Right.
sagebrush holds that moisture the sagebrush has a very deep root. It's got a tap root that goes way down there. And sagebrush is really one of I learned this in a talk that was put on by the Wyoming Wildlife Federation here in our state. They're an amazing conservation group. I love this group. And they brought out somebody who talked about the sagebrush sea. And so this is an impacted this, it doesn't just affect Wyoming, and Nevada is one of the states that they were really talking about in this discussion that they put on, because of how much sagebrush has been lost in Nevada. The sagebrush sea is the second largest living organism or ecosystem that is being destroyed. It's the second, I don't know how to say this the right way. It is second only to the rainforest in its loss of habitat and ecosystem, because we clear so many swaths of sagebrush for development and for grazing and for farmland and for all these other things. And yet it is so important to this, especially desert area, because of the way that it holds the grass or holds the moisture in. The snow packs into it, it holds that moisture in there. Then it seeps into the ground slowly, and it feeds that grass the way that it needs to be fed. And that's what causes that grass to grow and be so nutritious. So sagebrush is really, really important. And I wanted to add a second component to this before I answer the other question that you had posed regarding the herds themselves. But I know that Laura Lee has put out some information, and Wild Horse Education has put out a lot of information about how horses can survive on sagebrush, and they can. However, the terpenes in it, and there are a lot of things that make it actually toxic to a horse. So it's not something that they can survive on their own, but they will eat it, and they can eat the tops off of it. And one of the photos that we have, and it might be the exclusion and it might be Carrie's, I don't know. You can see where, I think it's the exclusion one. The sagebrush that's inside has some feathery stuff coming off of the top of it.
Yeah.
And everything outside does not have that. And those are the things the horses will eat. That's one of the things the horses will eat. And other animals, that's very important forage for some other animals, some of the wildlife species. And so when there are too many horses in the HMA and they're starting to graze on that because they don't have the access to the grass, that's when it starts to affect the other species that are in that ecosystem. It becomes very dangerous. And I can say that in Stewart Creek, it's actually not in Stewart Creek, it's right outside of Stewart Creek. There is a homestead out there and some people who live out there. Right now, you can see their house from the road. There's a paved road called Mineral X Road. You can see their house. On a good year, when we were not in drought, you can't see their house because the sagebrush is so much higher. And at this point, it's been taken down to a point where you can fully see their house. And that's usually how I kind of gauge the health of that range, is whether or not you can see their house. So to go back and answer your question specifically, I think it creates when the forage is not out there in the abundance that it needs to be, it does create a sense of poverty. And as I sort of mentioned before, you have that little nucleus, you have this nice little herd, and as they populate more, it spreads out and spreads out and spreads out, but the resources are still here. And so you have more competition for a resource that's right here. And you may have a resource here and a resource, you have two. I don't know if this is working real well in here, but you have two resources. And then you might have a lot of travel back and forth between those resources. That's impacting the land as well. But you also then, if you've got a more population and less resources, you have more competition occurring within that that dynamic. And so we have talked about how they do like to stay together at certain parts of the year, and that can be for protection. Foaling season, winter times, there's strength in numbers. And so they want to be together. They want to be closer to each other during those times. But especially in winter, that can be when those resources are very scarce. In the spring, those resources are just coming up. And so it definitely does increase the competition between them. It can increase the fighting between them. It can impact breeding behavior. It can impact a lot of different things. So it's, it is something that we need to look at. And then I'd like to throw this out there. Really, how common is fighting behavior between horses, and how much of it is created because of what we do? And when I say that, in the advocacy world, we like to see those big numbers of horses because it's really exciting for us. And photographers love to see those horses galloping across the range. They like to see them fighting. Those make the dramatic photos that sell. The power of the horse, all of those things are really appealing to us. But how natural is that really? And should we be promoting that even ethically? Or should we be promoting more of the peaceful, quiet grazing photos, because that's really what their nature is like? I mean, that's what they should be doing. That's the way that it should be going. It's the same with the wildlife. We don't see them fighting other than one time a year, and that's during their rut.
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of where I'm.
Can I
Very happy
interject?
comment. Yes.
First of all, I'm so glad you went there, Christi,
Thanks.
because, well, for two reasons. Because, yeah, we're talking about, you're talking about two things. First of all, the numbers. It comes back to the numbers. So, there is a sustainable number. And then when we get over that and we see all that drama, how is that impacting the wildlife? I sent the famous game camera picture of the horses, the Mesa Verde horses chasing the elk off the spring, because that spring is, about as big as a dinner plate. And yeah, when there's competition, this is not rocket science. When there's competition for resources, you have aggression. You have mares trampling their foals to death to get to water. I've seen those videos, and they're not pretty. But the other thing, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and I'm just starting to talk about it because it's very, I'm not, it's hard to talk about. Horses, every culture that has encountered a horse or horses, it's an archetype. Every culture that has horses are an archetype, you know, all the way back to the Greeks, the Native Americans, everybody of power and spirit and freedom, and this mythic archetypal story and image. I mean, an archetype goes so deep in our DNA, right? It's not logical. And, you know, just since you and I met 8 years ago, the boom in wild horse photography has been phenomenal. You know, anybody can buy a really good camera that does it for you. So, seen from a distance, those horses fighting and galloping across the horizon and stuff, they evoke all of this emotion in us. But as you know, you're smiling, up close and personal, it's not so pretty.
No,
And
not at
so
all.
from a point of view, how are we being responsible to these sentient beings that they're not struggling for their life running from BLM. They're struggling for their life, you know, through loss of habitat, loss of forage, loss of water. Now we're fooling with the breeding pool, which we need whatever tool we can use to lower the population and lower the impact on the other wildlife that depends on these resources. So, like I said, I'm not sure how to talk about it, but you have this huge swell of people's emotions attached to the archetype that's being sold to them, that have no connection to the reality. And as a case in point, you know, I have my photographs from Sparkle's band, and her band stallion, this magnificent Spanish looking, you know, gray with black points, just, man, he was the coolest. And I got in competition with a girl to get him, and I had it lined out. I had a tip trainer ready to get him. And what she told me is, I've never felt so connected to a horse. And I felt like, you know, what you're feeling, my connection to that horse on the range when I spent a day with that band. So for me, that was very successful art. She felt what I was experiencing. I was able to transmit that through my photographs. But for her, she thought that she had some real connection with that horse that she'd never seen through that archetype, because he was an archetypical band, you know, beautiful Spanish band stallion. So are we really serving these animals by promoting this mythology? And, you know, I struggle with it because I do, you know, every day I go out and I feel the energy of my horses and I work with them and I see how they respond to me if I'm grumpy, and, you know, that whole energetic connection and how magnificent they can be. But my horse did 3 squares a day. And so I don't know what else to say about it, because I'm still kind of trying to formulate how to talk about this, you know, kicking it around, this schism. And in a way, I mean, this is the last thing I'll say about that. It seems that it is the people who are most separated and divorced from nature, who are most married to the archetype.
Yes. Yeah.
And as is our struggle in trying to educate and say, you know, look, this is the reality, to an audience that doesn't want the reality. They want, basically, it's horse Bambi. You know, Spirit, what stallion of the and
Spirit of Cimarron, or
whatever.
Ouch.
Sorry, Lee.
Ouch! Again with the Cimarron. Come on.
So I with this, how do we overcome that enormous challenge, this schism,
Yeah.
So
horses?
yeah. That's a great question, Carrie. I agree with you 100%. I struggle with these things all the time because I mean, I have the romance in my heart, and I've dealt with, and you know this, that I've dealt with people that, you know, I really genuinely enjoyed these people and went out on the range with them and tried to pass on the knowledge that I have and try to get them to see that, you know, the romance end of it that they're selling is not always going to do the horse themselves the justice that they need. And it should never be about our egos. It's got to be about those horses. We've got to take us out of the equation and look at what's best for that animal. And I'm also a dog trainer in real life. That's my bread and butter. And we do it with dogs too. So I mean, it's a human trait. It's just a human trait. But you look at that. I've got some pictures that I sent to Jolyn, sorry, of a stallion. And I don't know what created the injuries on that stallion, if it was a fighting thing or if it was, it very well could have been a mountain lion. We don't know. But his whole, like the whole haunch, all the skin is
It's awful.
side. Yeah, it's
It's
awful.
awful.
It's gross. It's just hanging off the side of this horse. And that horse was gathered. And let me tell you, he was one mean jerk in that. And I mean, he was so mean. The BLM staff was like, we weren't going to put him back out because he doesn't fit anything that we wanted to put back out there, but he is a jerk. He is going back out. They had him in the pen with all the other stallions. And literally there was like 7 or 8 stallions and this horse. And wherever he went, they were as far away from him as they could be, huddled in this little group and like terrified. Oh, keep us away from that guy. And he is in the roughest, nastiest part of Stewart Creek HMA. He is so far away from everything. And I have often wondered what caused that injury. And he even still has this little dew flap that hangs off the side of his hip from that hit, you know, from all of that, whatever that injury was. And I've often wondered, you know, was it a human caused thing? Was it something that we did? You know, I ponder that all the time. How did he get that injury? Well, we'll never know. But how do we prevent those things from happening to them in the future? Or how do we work with those things? Or how do we do what's best for the horse?
Yeah. I want to go to
about people's emotions with the wild Mustangs is you'll see people make comments about pictures of gathers and this, that, and the other thing, and they'll want them to live wild and free, and we all want them to live wild and free. But the litmus test is what you want. Is it for your own emotions, or is it what the horses need? You know, does it fit in with the horse's game plan, or is it just going to make you feel better? And you know, a lot of donation button groups that they'll guaranteed make you feel better for $20. You know, send $20 and you will feel better because of it. And you know, it just, people don't have the idea what goes on out there. And I've always tried to get some pictures of stallions fighting, but I don't know why I can't get any pictures of stallions fighting. They're eating, but they're not fighting.
Maybe it's the numbers on the Kiger herd. I want to do some questions before we're completely out of time. So this is from one of our Facebook people, and it says, with wildfires, we've taken all the horses off the range and then returned some after the range has been restored. We've completely decimated areas that will never come back without intensive restoration efforts if there is rain. What are the panel suggestions for where to keep these horses along with all of the others that need to be removed? And how do we convince Congress to supply the required very large budget increase? That's a loaded question.
Well, last time I talked about lobbying Congress, and we basically have two choices. Either, and
Yeah.
this is not going to be popular, either enact the euthanasia clause of the Wild Horse and Burro Act, or we must have Congress fund more off-range pasture with the mandate that populations on range will be brought down to AML.
Yeah, I agree, Carrie. And I
Managed
think,
or meet option rate.
yeah, I think that I'd like to add that I personally know the person who within the BLM who is responsible for that. And I think that he is doing a good job. They're putting the solicitations and the bids out for
Mhm.
more on-range pasture or off-range pastures, I should say. And they are willing to look at, kind of outside the box things. And what I think would be helpful is for people to really understand those off-range pastures and to understand the hoops that need to be met, jumped through for those things. I've got another friend who manages a series of big ranches that are far from herd management areas. She's responsible for, I think, 7 big ranches, and it's a huge, huge area with good grass and everything else. And she did want to be an off-range pasture, but the paperwork she couldn't. Like, I know it's probably still on her radar, but the paperwork end of it, she's like, it's just monumental to go through. So, it's and right and should be. I mean, it should be. They're going to be responsible for caring for those horses for a long time.
Right.
So I think that it should be, but I think that we need to cut the BLM some slack on that, on the off-range pasture places, because they get threats.
Okay,
Well,
next question.
Tell me that those ranchers are shipping those horses out the back door to Mexico, and I just couldn't convince her otherwise.
Not happening.
So no.
Yeah.
Okay. Next
Yeah,
question.
Kerry's, one thing is Kerry stated that the solution that has to happen is the HMAs have to get down to AML, and the place for those horses that are removed has to happen. And
Right.
I think talk about looking outside the box, the BLM's going to have to look a little bit internal in their own box and figure out how they could set up some long-term holding areas with sterilized herds on public lands that exist. I've always brought up around the Hanford nuclear reactor area in Eastern Washington, tons and tons of federal land there. And it used to have 1 million horses out there at one time. Now it's not the kind of land that's, real sustainable, or, but if it's a place where they can put 100, 200 horses, and then have them managed, and it'll require supplemental feed, it'll require supplemental water probably, but I think that long-term holding is such a critical thing that the BLM, I don't think they're going to get enough private partnerships in that. I think they're going to have to look internally at where they can set up their own HMAs. But it's important that if they do get down to AML, they stay at AML. And
Exactly.
There's no point in removing all the horses if they're just going to allow them to increase their population over
Agreed.
what they're supposed to be again. Because it's going to cost money for this long-term holding, and it's a debt that only lasts 25 years till they're all passed away. But you have to have that firm decision on the financing for them.
Mm-hmm.
So a related
thing
question.
Well, go ahead, Joe.
Related question. Can long-term holding gelded horses and mares be rewilded into other states, i.e. East Coast? And why aren't bachelor stallions and stallions gelded and rewild after gelding?
Well, go ahead, somebody else. It's obvious answer.
The gelding has proved not to work. One stud will just service all the mares. And the whole term rewilding is kind of I hate that term. I absolutely despise that term, because you can't rewild. You're gonna be moving them out of the wild. You're gonna be putting them in a care situation, and there's no rewilding if they're in a care situation. They may live kind of wild, and they may live with wander around and do what they want, but you can't rewild. And that's the problem. You only get one chance for wild horses, and that's out in their HMAs. And so the term rewilding, I just hate that term.
Well, in addition, they rewilded horses in somewhere in Europe. I want to say Amsterdam or Czechoslovakia or something like that. Guess what? The horses reproduced so much that they had to take them out of there.
Yeah.
And horses are, this gets in, and nobody wants to hear this. They're an animal that's been domesticated for 6,000 years.
Yeah.
That's in their DNA. So yeah, they'd like to go. There's a burro running around 5 miles not 5 miles, just over the hill from me, and we'll see if he rewilds himself through the winter without getting eaten. But we'll see. The rewilding thing, and there's a sanctuary near me who is rewilding horses at about 10 times the stocking rate for here. So we'll see how that ends up.
So I just wanted to say that I like the idea of putting horses that have been taken from the wild into maybe some national park areas or state park areas or things like that. But as Lee mentioned very well and eloquently, they're not going to be rewilded. In a lot of those situations, those horses are going to have to be managed, as in fed, supplemental feed, supplemental water. So that's not living wild like they are now. But if they're gelded or they're sterilized mares, I'm for that. I don't see that happening in the state of Wyoming for good reason, because we have way too many horses in the state of Wyoming right now. The Wind River Indian Reservation has over 5,000 wild horses running loose, and they're starting to infiltrate. Yeah, they're starting to infiltrate some of the wildlife habitat management areas that are nowhere near any of the herd management areas either. So, just Wyoming itself has ridiculous numbers of horses. They took, I think it was really close to 2,000 horses off of the Red Desert, and then way more than that out of the Rock Springs area too. So,
well, when it comes to rewilding, I would like to know exactly where these horses would be rewilded to, because again, let's look at a map of the public lands. I just watched Ben Masters' nature thing on the Texas ocelot, which was fantastic. 5% of the land in Texas is public land, unlike Nevada, which is what, 80%? Mm-hmm. And you just can't, whether they're sterilized or gelded or not, there's just nowhere to dump horses where they're going to fit into the ecosystem. People are trying to, keep deer out of their yards. I don't know where these places are that people think that horses are going to be rewilded to.
Yeah.
What, Vermont, Maryland? Where's the public land for that?
Yeah.
Does somebody know something that I don't know, that there's,
Well, I think that there are some places, like I said, some parks, state parks or things like that, where people might enjoy seeing them, but it has to fit into their management plan. And were they there? I don't know. And then again, I think it also needs to go back to the horse itself.
Right.
Does the horse want to stay wild? There's a documentary coming, right? There's a documentary that'll be coming out soon, Women in the Wilderness. Those girls, those 3 girls, I want to give a shout out to them. They rode wild horses across the state of Wyoming to bring awareness to the situation. And they went and watched a wild horse gather in the Rock Springs area, and they had their wild Mustangs that they were riding stolen by a herd of wild horses. And I don't know if this is literally, and I don't know if this is going to come into the documentary or not, because they didn't get any of that on film because it wasn't, planned. but in the middle of the night, the wild horses came in and ran their horses off, and they had one horse left. And so they were riding that horse out. They were talking about how he was like sniffing the ground and would get on a trail, and they couldn't turn him off of the trail, and they knew he was on the trail of the other horses. But they never, I mean, they did find them eventually, but the horses were the ones that actually found the girls. The horses themselves, these are wild Mustangs that had been domesticated, and they backtracked 50 miles to find the girls. They went back down the trail 50 miles looking for their girls.
Oh,
And you know, and it's just cell phone footage, and I hope that they put it in the documentary, because I was bawling too. But it was so beautiful. Those girls driving down the road, they're like, "There's our horses!" And they jump out of the truck and they run over there, and the horses are so happy to see them too. They were looking for their girls. So, you know, there is that question too. Do the horses care if they're taken out of the wild? Are they happier? Do they, you know, Mary takes her horses back east, and granted, it's a completely different climate from what they've come from, anywhere from California to, you know, Wyoming area. You know, I think Wyoming is probably the furthest east that those horses would come out of. Totally different climates. But she says those horses choose to go in the barn. They choose to go in the stalls, and she gives them that choice. And they choose to do that when the weather's bad.
Yeah.
So
Well, I have no perimeter fencing, and I probably shouldn't admit it, but I let my horses out to graze. And, you know, they have a gallop around.
yeah,
They don't leave.
no,
They
they
could
know what it is.
on
Yeah.
and roads. Not, you know, it's not like I live on the highway, but they have never left the property, and I don't have fences. So yeah, I probably not the smartest thing to do, but when there's grass out, that's all they care about. And that's informative too. That is all they care about, is their groceries. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
yeah. Let's do one more question. This one is about genetic diversity. Can the panel share their thoughts on genetic diversity, and specifically with regard to the BLM strategies to increasingly group HMAs into complexes and manage them as metapopulations? Do you see a reason to be concerned that they are intentionally striving to dilute the gene pool and the uniqueness of the individual HMAs?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. At least not in Wyoming. I'm not going to speak for other states, but I think in Wyoming, managing as a complex is a smart idea, because like I said, Lost Creek is 60 to 80 horses. Stewart Creek adjoins that. It's 125 to 175 horses. Green Mountain is to the north, and it borders Stewart Creek. It's actually like sort of a donut area. I mean, it kind of goes around in a circle and with an open end on it. So allowing movement between those HMAs is going to continue to keep that genetic diversity in there. And Antelope Hills is one HMA I've not talked about, but the horses have that kind of they're really going back to that primitive look in that area. And that's an HMA that is not messed with much. It's pretty wild, it's pretty remote. But they did bring in some Kigers long ago to this to the Red Desert complex. And I don't know how many, but you really see the leg bars, you see the dorsal stripes, and you even see shoulder bars on those horses, and a lot of grullas and a lot of buckskin colorations, duns in that Antelope Hills. But we're seeing it now. The HMA directly to the south of Antelope Hills is Lost Creek, and we're seeing it in Lost Creek. We're seeing a little bit of that in Stewart Creek now too, and Crooks Mountain, which is the one to the north. So, you know, I think it's necessary.
Mhm. Yeah.
I have a thought at, and implied in that question, I mean, if you read it again, it was something about, do you think BLM is managing as a complex, like they are intentionally doing that to reduce? Can you read that section again? Do you think, read the question.
Matt, okay, could the panel share their thoughts on genetic diversity, specifically with regard to the BLM strategies to increasingly group HMAs into complexes and manage them as metapopulations? Do you see a reason for concern that they are intentionally striving to dilute the gene pool and the uniqueness of the individual HMAs?
That's the part I have a problem with, is there's an accusation there that BLM deliberately diluting the gene pool,
Yeah.
which I completely disagree with that. And for instance, I mean, the Kigers have been managed the way they have. That's, you know, one of the obvious ones. The sulfurs are a particular phenotype that actually, like the Kigers, has been managed for phenotype. Now that's gone, you know, more or less over the years, depending on who was in charge. They have, when I look in the, you know, the National Academy of Science report on page, you know, 235 or whatever it is, there is Gus Cothran's genetic research on all, at that time, I don't know, I want to say 218 HMAs, and the sulfurs have a reduced genetic diversity. Is that what tends to make them more sensitive and reactive? That, you know, I mean, they're famous for being difficult to work with.
Yeah.
Is it because lack of genetic diversity? Is it that there's so much Spanish blood in them? You know, Coco's first DNA is Andalusian. Those horses tend to be hotter, sensitive. You know, I don't know, but I would say BLM is not specifically, if anything, just the opposite. Like I said, in Spring Creek Basin, the population's been stable due to PZP. So they introduced three sand wash basin horses, because for one, they're from Colorado and they were close in phenotype, meaning they're, you know, trying to stay within the look of that HMA. So I don't see how that would translate to managing complexes together, because if anything, that would increase genetic diversity, but it may blend the phenotype of specific HMAs if there's a lot of crossover.
Right.
But
However,
how can
if you look
crossover?
at the checkerboard, you know, the Rock Springs office checkerboard, there's some migration between Adobe Town and Salt Wells. There's not a lot of travel between Salt Wells and Divide, because Route 80 goes through there. You know, there's, I think, 7 HMAs around that complex, and those horses don't travel as much, probably because Route 80 goes through the middle of them. But it doesn't make any sense to me that they would be creating complexes to reduce genetic diversity. That doesn't play.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole genetic diversity thing is, if anything, is going to be improved if it's managed as a large complex. Like that's what you want, you know. That the Kiger's genetic diversity has been managed. Every gather they'll add 2 or 3 mares from other HMAs in Oregon that are Kiger types. They won't like put a paint horse in there or something, but they have a huge resource of other HMAs with Kiger types in it. The Kigers basically represent a type of that can be found in all of Oregon, is one way to look at it. But they'll add mares. Apparently, the mares are the best way to increase genetic diversity, is to add a mare to a herd rather than. And they add 2 or 3 mares each gather cycle from other HMAs, you know, in around the Southern Oregon area. And genetic diversity in these small herds is rather important. And it's always been my biggest worry that it's going to be the first thing they're not going to care about anymore. If things get really tight, they're not going to put that kind of effort into it. Whereas if you have an HMA with 500-600 horses, genetic diversity usually isn't going to be an issue. There's really no point in worrying too much about it at that point. The figure one biologist came up with years ago was 150 was needed to maintain genetic diversity. That same biologist picked up some BLM contracts a few years later and doesn't stand by that number anymore. But genetic diversity is something that can be ruined rather quickly and takes a long time to repair and get back to where you want it. And Mustangs are mutts, and that's probably the one thing that's saving them, is they are mutts with all kinds of DNA in them from all kinds of horses. And genetic diversity, especially as a lot of these HMAs that have been for years now, up around 300-400, that have been gathered down now to 80 or 60 where they are supposed to be. It's important that it's dealt with, and I fear some of the other states that have never really dealt with small HMAs like that won't put the effort into it that Oregon does. But it was encouraging what Kerry said about that they moving those sandwash mares over, and what that really does too is it simulates if there was no fences around, back in the day when there was no fences, and regardless of whether a herd has genetic diversity issues, the horses should be moved around like that into different HMAs, just as a matter of practice for genetic diversity issues. But so I hope some of the other states that are now dealing with low numbers in areas, and if they're going to keep them low, put the effort into the genetic diversity measures that need to be taken for that. One thing I've noticed with the Kigers, I've watched their cycles after gathers, when they gather them down to 50 and then they get up to about 120 and they'd gather again. It always upset me because year 1 and 2 after a gather, there's not a lot of mixing going on. There's just a couple big bands and there's not a lot really going on. Come year 3, the population gets up there and you start seeing new bands created. Come year 4, there's a big enough population that things really start getting diversified and stuff. That's at around 120 horses. But that's when they would do a gather. And so, it was one good point of them not gathering was I've been able to see what happens beyond year 4 if they didn't gather. And I was expecting, these bands would just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but they didn't. Seasonally, when they're kind of bunched up, you might see over 100 in one area. I've seen up to 140, I think it was, in one area before. Wow. But most of the time they spread out into 3 groups of 80, and 80 seems to be a really good number that anything over that, like, and I'm talking 80 in a group, not spread out over 100,000 acres, but 80 that intermingle with each other. Anything over that would probably, I'm beginning to think that they would branch out and become a whole different region and move into another region, and that's it. So I don't think that 80 will stay close together up to 120, 140 and stay that way. I think at about 80, naturally they have that internal mechanism that sends them off and they go look for newer areas. There's too much pressure with over 80 horses. And so the natural genetic diversity that the Mustangs can deal with is, so I hate to see an HMA lower than 80. But then again, if they keep them at 120, what I would like to see for the Kigers in the future, and I've been pushing the BLM for a couple of years now to do bait trapping, and when the population was at 120, 140, just do bait trapping and keep it at high AML for a while, and then because it just seems to work better there. So, hopefully, some HMAs get down to as low as 40, and I would hate to think that they would have to let them overpopulate to hit 200 before they start dealing with anything again. Keep them where they're supposed to be, but deal with the genetic diversity issues, and it has to be part of the management plan in any HMA with under 80 horses. Let's say I would say it has to be really important part of the management plan.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
I've never seen 80 horses all together, but I've been in much bigger places, usually about 20 is the most I've seen together.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk again.
Thank
Great.
Thank you very much and very much enjoyed it.
Go. Yes. Good night.
Bye.